All right, we're live. Welcome to American Spirits episode 8. Is this 8? We're doing a lot of these now, so I'm starting to lose track, which is good. The show's doing very well, so thank you for tuning in. And today we are reading, or reviewing rather, a book titled The Search for Order by Robert H. Weeb, subtitle 1877 to 1920. That is the years that it covers. This was published in 1967, so it's what is that? It's about 60 years old, roughly. So this is a fairly old book, still a post-war book. But the reason I wanted to cover this book in particular is because, well, it's a book I've reviewed before on my own Substack, and I think it capstones the book we read 2 weeks ago, The Frontier in American History by Frederick Jackson Turner, very well. In fact, Mr. Turner is referenced by name twice in this book by Mr. Weeb. And I think this caps off the closing of the frontier and what happened to America when that frontier closed, which certainly was not necessarily all positive. But before we start getting into the discussion, thank you, Mr. Turnipseed, for joining me again as co-host. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you doing, Charlie?
Well, hopefully I'm fine. I'll just leave it at that. And yeah, now we have Clossington here this week joining us, fellow founder of the OGC. Thank you for joining us, Clossington, to discuss the book.
I'm glad to actually participate in this particular live stream. Usually I have, I don't know, like 3 or 4 different niches that I actually cover. Usually I cover colonial history, history of secret societies, history of American infrastructure, and niche sort of naval history, esoterica. But today you actually decided to resurrect my persona just in favor of this sort of niche topic of Labor Day, right? It's Labor Day right now. Had a nice weekend off, and for some reason you guys decided to have me read this 400-page book. I don't know. It was, I wouldn't say it's a fun read, but it's definitely a nice niche read in terms of an overlooked sector of American history that not too many people actually know about or care to actually study about, right?
Definitely. And, I did not even realize that we had scheduled this particular review for Labor Day, but it's actually quite fitting, I think, that it coincidentally happens to occur today. Indeed, I did not particularly enjoy the read as well. I can't pinpoint exactly why. I have read the book before. It is a very informative book. So, but it is a bit of a slog, and it felt like 400 pages. It's actually only 300, but understandable.
So,
but yeah, this period is not well covered in our spheres, and I think that's why this is interesting to talk about. Sorry,
I think I can actually particularly pinpoint why it's kind of a slog to actually get through, right? The period that this book covers is between the end of Reconstruction, right, in the early 1920s, and this particular period is punctuated by, I guess, what you call the internascent, rise and fall of the labor movement, the development of the professional, managerial, sort of middle class, the birth of American capital as its own independent body, and then the birth of independent American foreign policy, which is something of a niche that I'd like to get into um, as on its own right. But I'll hand it off to you to set up the sort of preface to this book.
Yes, well, as you said, the main topic of the book is really the birth of national power and the development of the middle class as a bureaucratic managerial class that facilitated the means by which national power could be exercised. Additionally, the glut of wealth available for a national government to use that was now accessible mainly through the development of railroads, but also these bureaucratic managerial techniques to control and access that wealth, even in a, at that stage, very nascent and unrefined way. This was now a new power. There's some line in the book where it talks about how this is the first time the national government was actually generating surpluses of income, which provided the means for the national government to sort of act as a cohesive whole. And there are a lot of birthing pains in doing that as well. And of course, it's also about the closing of the frontier, more towards the beginning of the book, or the earlier parts of the period it's covering. So what happened to those frontier communities and such as they were penetrated by this network of railroads and the new economic paradigms that came with it. Ryan, do you have anything you'd like to say in introduction, and then I'll hand it back to Clossington?
Right. So on top of just the part about the frontiers and national power, it is, and this is explicit in the book's narrative. It's also the death of the old system. If anyone who has been watching the last 7 streams at this point, I suppose it would be, remembers that the more Puritan settled parts of the country and their ideas carried with it a great emphasis on the community and local autonomy and liberties of the community. People, especially that tuned in for the first 2 streams, should remember that. This is the transformation and eventual death of that system. The community, though every American lives in a community of some kind, this is sort of the death of the community, disciplining and homogenizing people within the community, people using the community as a power base, and the community serving as just the focal point of American life. This is also a time period of centralization, which with its centralization comes people that sort of backlash against it. The populists and the Grange movements come to mind, viewing these moves as ultimately bad. These centralizing economic and political tendencies bring with it corruption, destruction of the old way of life, and whatnot else, and therefore needs to be destroyed. But the new bureaucratic form of the middle class, which for people that have listened should also note that this itself is a new expression of the middle class, this brings with it new political ideas as well. So it's they do not really care so much that the centralization is happening. They seek to wield it for good. I don't want to get into any fictional analogies because I hate those, so do not take what I just said in that manner. Those are the 2 sides, though. We have sort of people trying to force the old system to stay around that ultimately do not succeed, and then we have the new bureaucratic class really forming the foundation of what we now know as the progressive era, trying to use the centralization for good of the country. We can discuss, and I'm sure we will later, the implications and consequences of these things. But this is ultimately the subject of the book, is those forces at play.
Yeah, go ahead, Clossington.
So whenever you actually go to, okay, so I know that many of our listeners are presumably homeless and or vagrant. So whenever you're hanging out around a railway tracks, um, every single railway track that you come across is exactly 4 foot, 8.5 inches across between the different railway gauges. And the fact that this is the standard across the entire American nationality is because that this was the national railway gauge standard that we implemented after Reconstruction. After Reconstruction, after the Great Civil War happened, we endeavored upon a great national subsidization of our our national infrastructure, building all sorts of railroads, particularly in the Midwest and out west, to develop the untapped resources and ranches out west and the mines out west and all sorts of granaries out west that wouldn't have actually been profitable if we didn't actually subsidize these railroads. But the book starts in the early 1870s with the sort of collapse of the speculative boom, partially subsidized by the federal government, where we subsidized the development of the West and the Midwest. And in the collapse of the speculative, nationally funded boom, you end up with this very, stringent gold standard, um, you know, particularly financially strict Republican gold standard regime that gives way to sort of professional managerial sort of Americana, developmental class that I think we can get into, but
Let's
I'm
let's let's try and
sure.
focus on that word managerial. Like, what does that actually mean in this context? And the one of the key things to focus on in the history that this book presents is, as we said, the community, but specifically the deeply personal nature of the community and the fact that the people in the community all did literally know each other and have their own very private politics and squabbles. You'd have Democrats and Republicans, for example, but whatever particular battles that those parties might have had, it was almost a sort of sporting event as described in the book, simply because the stakes were so low and it was not actually integrated into some national party, right? Additionally, uh, the interpersonal nature of the community changed, and I have a particular quote I found right here that I thought was interesting. I didn't submit this to the screenshot. I had just way too many screenshots to load, so we're just going to read them from our screens. Hopefully, that's fine with the viewers. I think it will be. And this is about how a store merchant might interact. So, whereas before the local merchant would acquire his goods locally or in nearby communities in face to face personal interactions, quote, now he transacted most of his business from a price list, end quote. So basically, these large companies that were now connected to these communities by railroad simply had lists of goods. You would place orders on a piece of paper. The paper would then move literally on rail or by telegram, whatever, to the business back in the East, and then the goods would be shipped to you. And now there was no longer this personal transaction happening between people. And this is how does this relate to my question about managerialism? Well, the the problem that the East faced is how to integrate the West into its national enterprise. If you remember the Frontier in American History book, it sort of described this phased progression of the frontier. And at this point, the Midwest had already been fully developed by these rail networks and had turned into these industrial cities. And now the some of the major businessmen on the East Coast, like J.P. Morgan, comes up many times in the books. In the book, they need to integrate their business with the West. How do you do that? You have to do that through standardized systems. You mentioned the railroads, right? The book mentions how we have many railroad gauges until they were standardized into what is it, 8 feet 4 inches or something. I forget what you mentioned, or 4 foot 8 inches, I think, not 8 feet.
It's
In any
4 foot
case,
8.5.
4 foot
FYI.
8.5 inches, right? So that is part of this, and standards coming in from the outside of these communities, homogenizing them, changing them for the purpose of distant managers to literally have a means by which they could interact with so many different places. So this is what
Well, I have a
managerialism.
slightly different standard. Um, Before J.P. Morgan, of course, there was J.D. Rockefeller, right? Um, so, quick question: where does the first oil boom occur in the United States? Quick question.
Oklahoma.
No,
It wouldn't
actually,
be like Pennsylvania or something like that.
it is Pennsylvania. Western Pennsylvania has the first oil boom in 1959. And I actually did a whole lot of research into this particular topic when I was streaming with Christopher Sandbach on the whale oil boom and bust. But there's a massive boom in oil production in Western Pennsylvania. Like I've actually seen some of these boom and bust towns out in Appalachia. But what happens is that over the next few years, there's just this massive boom in supply that's trying to keep up with whale oil demand prices. And this comes to a head in the mid 1860s, where you end up with Standard Oil, who ends up buying out all of these intermodal freight companies, these railway companies that end up supplying the rest of the oil to the United States, to like throughout the United States. And this makes a very few number of individuals very, very wealthy. We have, of course, Jay Gould, who I'm sure we'll get to it eventually, but the people who run these railways that can transport oil very rapidly end up becoming very, very wealthy overnight in these speculative booms. A lot of them end up being particularly inscrutable individuals. Like Jay Gould, I remember has a particular quote where he says, "I wish I could pay one half of the proletariat to kill the other half, just to decrease supply of, labor." But the thing is, labor ends up biting him back in particularly vicious labor wars throughout the 1870s. And I'm sure we can get into that later on. But this first sort of labor or railway boom is what really causes these sort of robber baron wars that eventually cause all sorts of questions of centralization and standardization into question as the social question that the book posits.
Yes, capital letter the social question is one of the major things addressed in how people. It was the question people were asking at the time, and the social question encompassed a great many things. What it centrally was is how are all of these new industrial developments supposed to interact with communities? How are they supposed to uplift the slums in the urban areas? How are they supposed to uh, integrate with these communities without destroying them? What is the proper relationship there? That's like the essence of the social question. It's a big capital letter question because it involves lots of these different sub questions.
Well, the question is fundamentally arbitrage. So you're a farmer in the middle of Iowa or Ohio or whatever, and there's one single railway that transports your goods out west where it's sold, right? You're like a wheat or corn farmer, and you make a profit off of the price that you sell to the railway minus the cost that they charge per freight unit, right? And the question is, some of these particular railway monopolies are so monopolistic that there's the actual price margins are squeezed, and you know they end up the railway companies end up charging exorbitant rates for particular farmers out in the Midwest and the West. And this comes into question. This poses the question, like, is there any sort of is there any sort of organization that labor can promote that suppresses the costs of railways, that eats into their profit margins, but subsidizes the farmers. And this is the sort of central question that racks the populist movement of the late 19th century.
And it's an interesting problem because these commercial farms only experienced these problems because they scaled up to a commercial level, integrated outside of their community through rail in the first place. So one of the things that this book, well, let me at this point, since we've been going for 20 minutes, I just want to point out a few problems with the narrative that the author tells in the book. I think overall it's a good history book of the period, but there are certainly a few things that the author seems to believe that are not, I would say, accurate. First one is he sort of describes the middle class as this new class, as something that didn't exist before, and it sort of replaces like a frontier yeomanry. It does do that, but as we know from previous studies, middle class certainly existed in America before the middle class he speaks of developed. So while it's certainly true that a different type of managerial middle class developed, particularly in urban areas through professional organizations, creating various types of unions and associations, the phenomena of a middle class was not new. That's one major problem in the book's overall thesis.
Well,
Second,
I actually have to like bite a little bit back on this as like a sort of central problem, right? But I'm sure we can get to it as soon as you addressed your second issue with the book, right?
well, the second major issue is he describes. Actually, I'll read the quote. It's in the first screenshot I'd taken. I'll just read, quote, "An age never lent itself more readily to sweeping uniform description, nationalization, industrialization, mechanization, urbanization. Yet to almost all of the people who created them, these themes meant only dislocation and bewilderment. America in the late 19th century was a society without a core. It lacked those national centers of authority and information which might have given order to such swift changes. American institutions were still oriented toward a community life, family and church, etc." End quote. I think this paragraph hints at a let's just say problematic perspective that the author has, which is specifically in the statement that America was a society without a core. America was many societies with many cores. And he even mentions how America was oriented toward community life. There's sort of this implicit perspective that is an invalid concept in terms of what is the core of America, because otherwise the sentence would be worded differently. That's how I would word the sentence, right? Is that America was a society with many cores, and as we've discussed in our streams in this series, they shared many things in common, but they were fundamentally not under some centralized authority. So that's one of the things I wanted to point out in terms of the author's perspective. As far as the point on the middle class, I'd be interested in like what your particular dispute is there, because, well, go ahead.
So I guess the central conceit, right, is in terms of arbitrage and information sharing, right, and how societal status is awarded to individuals localized, because I guess the two particular institutions named are the American, was it like for doctors, the American like Health Association or whatever it's called, and then the bar for lawyers, right? A sort of national standardization and quality control for these two particular um, occupational institutions. And this comes about from a few different sort of necessities that are called upon uh, almost pragmatically, right? So locally, if you have a doctor and you're in a small town that only can produce one single doctor, uh, the doctor's reputation lives and dies based off of his reputation within the community. However, the middle class um, emerges also by, I guess, the fact that lawyers as an institution, lawyers were brought up upon by this sort of apprentice system up until the late 19th century, but there are sort of institutional standardization networks that emerge out of these two professions that create standards that, through different means of testing these individuals, produces a cohesive certification, I guess, that can be transferred from polity to polity, community to community, that produces a culture that is nonpartisan, professional, and focused on producing apolitical results. And this is what creates essentially the middle class, as this book dictates. Although I'm very familiar with the sort of societies that this movement creates as a result. Just as a professional engineer, I see these exact same institutions created for engineers, where you have to go through an exam, you have to go um, through a period of certifiable, apprenticeship, and you have to continue with your vocation over the next, throughout your career, essentially, as a professional of the managerial class. If you're a doctor, you should pursue your overall vocation by improving the empirical science of health, right? If you're a doctor, you should, you gain status by helping other doctors in figuring out certain predicaments that they might also come across, right? This is the sort of nonpartisan, progressive um, institution of the middle class that emerges in this particular period.
Well, I do want to quibble with that description a little bit, not even from a personal perspective, because the book does point out, in addition to those, perhaps we could say, admirable aims in improving society, there was a significant amount of self-interest and in these organizations. For example, the teachers union. I can't remember the name of the union. It might have just been teachers union. The teachers were fairly late to organize and wanted to increase their pay and status. Basically, all of these organizations are self-interested professionals who are organizing in order to increase their own power and influence and status and get paid more, because now power is actually up for grabs. As national power that spreads its tendrils of control across the entire country enters into the fray, now that this power is available for competition, all of these different professionals want to collectivize in order to compete for this new power that's available. Whereas before, there wasn't a reason to do that. And the author does point this out. So while progressivism does have these noble interests, which in many cases were actually achieved, there is also this deeply self-interested component to it. And that is not to condemn the whole concept of self-interest, but it is to point out, especially for people listening today, since these structures still exist, there is a large component of self-interest at work, probably now more than ever in these institutions.
And
Ryan, you've
there's
been
something
quiet
else.
for a while. Yeah.
Well, there's something else on this issue in particular that might bring up the original point that Charlemagne was talking about. The book introduces the idea of the middle class like most people get in like their social studies or history class. The middle class is this thing that existed sometime after Reconstruction and before like the 1990s, that includes like doctors, lawyers, ministers, clerks, bureaucrats, and whatever else. And it forms like the beating heart of the country. That's like the definition that the book we're reading uses. It's a very standard one. But if anyone in the audience has been paying attention to us, especially from the start of like the Albion siege stream and the creating the Commonwealth, we've been talking about this other idea of a middle class that's permeated American society. This class that is productive. It is below the aristocracy and usually is somewhat dismal towards it. But it's also above just like the landless labor class. This idea of a middle class is what formed the sort of the foundation of the communities that the book starts out with. These very local, autonomous, independent communities that pre-exist the more centralizing tendencies that form the core of this book. The middle class that comes about is perhaps owning somewhat less. We don't typically characterize the middle class that this book and most other people talk about as being landowning, even though that's how we've understood it up until this point. So there's a difference in definition, and I personally tend to find the more common one, the more mainstream one, the middle class is these groups of workers to be somewhat more ahistorical. But that might be getting closer to what Charlemagne was originally pointing out, or maybe not. He can correct me.
I mean,
Well, the author identifies a unique component of the middle class, according to him, that this is the difference between this middle class and other existing classes or groups is that they developed a national class consciousness across professions, and that is what distinguishes them as a class. Perhaps it's sort of a difference in how the word class is used. I would also argue, though, that from the books we have read on the Puritans, for example, I would say that the Puritans certainly did have a class consciousness in terms of how they organized their society. It was directed at very different ways because the middle class was the class in power deliberately, and it was not something that developed in the Americas. It was brought over specifically to the Americas in order to not have a upper and lower class and be all middle class. Whereas here, we are talking about a new class that emerged and developed a class consciousness in the sense that it is a group of people competing for power. So I suppose it sort of depends on how we want to use the word class here, but Clossington, yes. Go ahead.
So the way that I interpreted middle class within the confines of this particular book is defining it as petite bourgeoisie in the sort of Marxian terms, where it defines individuals within the petite bourgeoisie as those that own small businesses within a particular profession. So you have like a doctor who establishes a practice within their local community and has a certain divested financial interest in actually creating a business that is profitable for themselves, but also profits them in terms of more abstract means, such as developing the physician profession as a whole. So, in I guess my professional life, as an engineer, I belong to various engineering societies, and I have an engineering license to stamp my name as a professional engineer. My job as an engineer is to, I guess, accrue enough capital to become a part owner in the franchise, in the business that I partake in, but also develop the profession holistically as an engineer by participating in various societies and research, um, endeavors. So the middle class is defined as individuals that own a stake in the businesses that they operate in and also develop the profession as a sort of researcher, as a sort of um, side hustle almost, or as something that benefits them and their society as a whole. So this is how I define, I guess, how I would define the middle class, and how I guess the author defines the middle class as well.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And this, either way, this is the class of people, the group of people that replaced the independent yeoman, as the author describes, uh, by standardizing everything. And there needs to be a reflection in by contemporary Americans on this phenomena, because the question at the time was, how is national power to develop as a coherent, uh, centralized entity that would be able to improve apply the best standards across the entire country uniformly, so that everyone could enjoy the fruits of modern industrial advances and knowledge in science and in medicine and pretty much any other category. This philanthropic concept. How do we not just advocate but actually bring these standards to the entire country? The thing we have to reckon with is this development wasn't inevitable, but if if that is your goal, you basically have to reconcile the fact that that is in fact going to eliminate the frontier as a concept, right? And we previously discussed the importance of the frontier in American history and how it seems essential to the American character in order to have this frontier that one can physically go into and develop and pursue in a very um, basically uncontrolled way. And it seems that, at least in the way things developed, in the way things developed, we can say that concept was irreconcilable with the solutions that were imposed by national power, which, of course, is something I think a lot of listeners might celebrate. I think it's very common to celebrate American power, right? But that power came at a cost. An observation I had made, Ryan. Actually, why don't you? Looks like you wanted to speak up here.
Yeah. I was just going to say this is one of the elements, since we start out by asking what do we mean by managerial. This is one of the elements, is that since it's national in scope, this new variant or form of the middle class sought to bring that national power, standardize it, make it more efficient, and subsume the things under it into that national power. It's usually under the guise of reform, efficiency, increase in standards, and anti-corruption and whatnot else. This sort of outside bureaucratic reform movement is very characteristic of this more managerial character of the new middle class, and it is very much a sort of Faustian bargain. Where if we say up until now the core of the country has lied in its autonomous communities on the frontier, or even not on the frontier, where people knew each other. It was centered around the locality, and that was where the liberty lied fundamentally. Um, then getting rid of that in the pursuit of power, I think, is just basically straight out of the story. Not to, and I certainly do not mean to invoke any sort of 20th century analysis by alluding to that. It's just it's what comes to mind. This this idea of the bureaucrats sort of trading away part of the soul of the country for power in the sense that it was wielded in the 20th century.
Well, I mean, part of the issue posed at the beginning of the book, right, was that how does, Rockefeller as this Standard Oil Trust executive exert control upon every single oil well across the United States? And the simple answer is that there's an information problem, and he cannot actually exert any sort of standardization or labor controls across the board. And the solution posed is this progressive movement where the nation or national politics as a whole eventually regulates the trust that is unable to manage itself because of certain information problem. And there are all sorts of theories posited as to the cybernetic state that is able to self-regulate itself publicly rather than privately, but most of those fail. Uh, Most of the the private options of regulation end up becoming these sorts of just handshake deal, corrupt bargains throughout the progressive movement as it develops, though. Um, but I guess the central question is like, hey, you started out in the middle of the 19th century with these isolated communities. You have uh, the sort of social lubricant of infrastructure like the railways and canals and what have you that connect all these isolated communities. And you have sort of centralizing capital that creates these monopolies that squeeze profit out of these localized communities. And the self regulating mechanism ends up being either a sort of national bureaucratic politics or, I guess, I mean, or these various labor movements, which end up, fizzling out over time. So that's sort of the central thesis of the book, if I'd have to put it in any other ways, right?
Yes, I want to now read a couple more things from the book to give us a few concrete things to focus on. And there are uh, I just have far too many things we could potentially discuss. Like we could talk about the populists, but I want to focus on a few particular things that'll be familiar to us. So let's see. Talking about the courts, the Supreme Court. Quote, unquestionably, recent additions to the court, Chief Justice Melville W. Fuller and Associate Justices David J. Brewer and Rufus W. Peckham, had smoothed the transition to an explicit defense of order and property. Like their assiduous mentor, Justice Stephen J. Field, these men openly sought to destroy what Field had called as early as 1883 the agrarian and despoiling spirit. Nationwide discontent had brought looking backward nearer than a dream. Brewer warned, and the court must meet the assault with an iron resolve. The greater the threatened consequences of popular or populistic wrath may be, the eminent lawyer Joseph H. Choate had told the justices during the arguments on the income tax, the greater the court's obligation to strike down radical laws. As Fuller's decision indicated, the income tax ruling had repulsed an attack upon accumulated property by mere force of numbers. End quote. So one of the things the book identifies is the courts, the Supreme Court as well. They begin more aggressively intervening in matters of law that relate to the social question and particularly how property is to be organized in the United States. And this is a new phenomenon, and this is something we're all familiar with the process of judicial review from Marbury versus Madison, but this time period is when that really began to be uh, more utilized in a way that we would be familiar with over 100 years later. Now, should also point out that the courts were still very, they were not overbearing and they were careful with this power, but they were effectively legislating from the bench in some ways on the social question. I want to read another quotation on the courts here. Let me find it real quick. Yeah.
Is it on how the power of the executive and legislature kind of waned throughout this period and gave way to the sort of social commentary of the Supreme Courts?
Yeah, well, one of the themes of the book is the legislative power waning. The executive power, which had previously been a weak power, began competing to be able to act on a national level, but also the courts were as well. Let's see, yeah. Quote, the most dramatic extension of power had been made by the national judiciary, which now more or less completed the pattern it had been developing since the 80s. In 1898, the Supreme Court announced one more precise formula, a very generous device for protecting railroad income from the effects of state legislation. In general, however, the courts had managed to avoid ironclad rules in spite of the pressures for exactness. Through such extremely flexible doctrines as due process, equal protection of the law, liberty of contract, and the public purpose of a tax, judges at every level preserved their freedom to intervene when, where, and how they wished across the domain of imperial scope. End quote. So the judges were reticent to lay down very, very specific rulings on exactly what the limits were in terms of what states were and were not allowed to do. And you see this today. Judges are very careful to not be overly exact in their rulings, such as to not legislate from the bench, but also to maintain their own freedom of action. So the judges are intervening in legislation at the state level, at the national level, but they're doing it in this way that actually preserves their power to make different decisions later on other slightly different specific scenarios. So I found this really interesting because, we sort of view this as a more phenomenon, but it's important to recognize this as something that actually developed along with the managerial class in the late 1890s as every aspect of government and society that had any relation to law and power, they were all searching for the means by which they could utilize their tools in order to make decisions on what the answer to the social question was.
And this is somewhat important, is that the court that dominates this period is the fuller court. And it is correct, they were trying to maintain their own power and interest. They did, however, tend to fall closer to the older way of doing things more often than not, because it's a lot of the opinions of the fuller court that get reversed by the later New Deal and the civil rights movements, which is something else that I find quite interesting. This is an era where throughout this the wave of centralization, the courts are not exempt from it and sometimes drive it. Yet they do still rule beneficially for the old American order that was rapidly getting subsumed, and only in later worse movements do these opinions get destroyed, basically.
There was another thing I want to mention, worth mentioning, is the universities. So I'll read another quote on the universities. Quote, the universities played a crucial role in almost all of these movements. Since the emergence of the modern graduate school in the 70s, the best universities had been serving as outposts of professional self-consciousness, frankly preparing young men for professions that did not yet exist. By 1900, they had an unquestioned power to legitimize, for no new profession felt complete or scientific without its distinct academic curriculum. They provided centers for philosophizing and propagandizing, and they inculcated apprentices with the proper values and goals. Considering the potential of the universities for frustration, it was extremely important that higher education permissively, even indiscriminately, welcomed each of the new groups in turn. The universities became virtually the exclusive home of several other professions whose early history could be read as an increasingly refined self-consciousness among members of the old American Social Science Association. During the 80s, the American Historical Association, the American Economics Association, and the American Statistics Association broke away from the parent group, the American Political Science Association, and the American Sociological Society followed in 1903, along with psychology, which preferred classification with the behavioral sciences. Each of these represented a highly articulate discipline, jealous of its identity, zealous to spread its scientific message, and influential in the lives of countless members of the middle class. End quote. So this makes the observation of the essential role the universities played in the development of the middle class, in the training of the persons, but also the legitimizing of all of these different fields of study. Particularly, the legitimizing came through this word scientific. The entire, I didn't want to harp on this because it's kind of a meme, but Darwin's theories are mentioned a few times in the book because, of course, they are about biological, how biological theories, survival of the fittest, and all this sort of thing came into vogue and were applied in fields outside of biology. And it was essential that any given field had a quote unquote scientific methodology to it, or else it was not seen as legitimate. And of course, the source of scientific legitimacy came ultimately from the universities.
I'd like. I'm sorry.
You first. You first.
I'd like to posit that there are two different, means of cloaking progressive policy during this period. So the first was by cloaking it with the social gospel, prosperity gospel stuff, very non-denominational Christian language, ends up cloaking whatever sort of progressive era policies that they're trying to propose. The other is Darwinian language, where I believe you actually punctuated in your notes that they cloaked the language of opposing the gold standard with the fact that, it's Darwinian to have very exclusive access to credit and gold reserves, and it's anti-Darwinian to actually allow for, the unwashed masses to have access to credit, or at least cheapened credit if you expanded beyond the gold standard and into the silver standard, which is both profane and anti-Darwinian. So that's how they couch it, right?
Well, the scientific does a lot of heavy lifting as well. This idea of an empirical branch of social sciences, it's an old talking point at this point. But since we're talking about this era in history, and since it's so normalized in the modern day, it might be worth pointing out that the way the things that we can now call the social sciences, the way that they were studied prior to this era was through reading the old classic works and deliberating about these social issues, usually from a very explicit ethical standpoint. The introduction of empirics to the social sciences, social organization, politics, economics, and whatnot else, sort of tried to subsume all of these different disputes into one nonpartisan sort of universal theory throughout all of these things based around empirical evidence. Of course, it was anything except nonpartisan, and most of this science usually ended up just serving the political power base that the scientists belong to, as it is today. So this is I think this is an unmitigatably terrible development in the country. It's a power base that has never really worked in our favor, and is it's very difficult to argue against it because it's seen as just a objective fact. It's hard to argue against the foundation of all of this, especially in the list. If you recall, it was economics and statistics are two of the big ones. Two of the things that make it easiest to justify any policy so long as you can manipulate data well enough. So this is a very pernicious, a very insidious development.
Definitely. Another thing, Clossington, you actually mentioned this idea of silver coinage. This is another thing that's mentioned in the book a few times, and it's a major part of American history at this time, which is the debate over whether or not money should be minted in silver or if the United States money supply should be only tied to gold. And this had serious social implications that crossed class boundaries, particularly, but also geographic ones, because the issue is gold being a physical medium that exists in a place, mostly existed on the East Coast. So your money is gold, and the gold is concentrated on the East Coast in the hands, mostly at this point, it begins accumulating in the hands of these sort of these captains of industry, these giants. You mentioned Rockefeller, I mentioned Morgan, right? These people literally have the gold. The people in the West need liquid capital credit to be able to perform their economic activities, grow their business. And at this point in time, you're extracting large amounts of silver out of the ground. And the idea is that silver is so much more abundant than gold. But it's still a precious metal. As we know, the gold is like 100 times more valuable than silver, which gives silver this more democratic nature, this more accessible nature. If you coin silver, then suddenly the vast majorities of the country will suddenly have access to this minted wealth that is directly transferable to gold, because it's now the idea is if it was minted by the U.S. Treasury, right, then it would be it would have the same legitimacy as gold. So there was this whole free silver movement that also was involved with the Populist Party at the time over whether or not silver should be minted. And of course, the people out west tended to prefer the minting of silver because it would give them access to money that they did not have access to before. But of course, the power in the East Coast, we talked about the East Coast power in our Frontier in American History stream 2 weeks ago, wanted to maintain their control over the country effectively. And the minting of silver coins would quite literally devolve their financial power broadly along democratic lines. So, yeah, did anyone want to comment on free silver or anything like that specifically?
Just briefly, the big thing about the populists as well was not just necessarily access to money or credit, but also just the fact that it was anything to undermine the Eastern power base. So the things that you're talking about there, having a silver standard or double standard, gold and silver being minted at the same time, it was very explicitly recognized that this would undercut the power based out east. Something that's interesting is that this is a policy that ran against both of the major parties at the time, the Democratic and the Republican Party. This was very much a Western phenomenon. It ends up getting subsumed by the Democratic Party in large part, but especially throughout the end of the 19th century, before it was subsumed fully into the Democratic Party, this was a very rebellious policy, and there were justifications against it as well. So the argument in favor, of course, was that the West was currency starved, as was the South and most of the other places that populists were popular in. And then the people out east would argue that it would be excessively inflationary, as well as a whole slew of other economic issues. But fundamentally, in the political scene and in the cultural scene, this did come down to a rebelling West finally getting its own political formula to oppose the powers that have been trying to control it basically since its existence, as we discussed a couple of weeks ago.
I guess so in terms of actually putting pen to paper, in terms of what does it actually mean to have a silver standard rather than just a gold exclusive standard, right? So a bank has, $1 million worth in gold, and they essentially write banknotes, right? One single dollar is worth, 10 grains of gold or whatever that is exchangeable in specie gold if you actually go to the bank. You have physical gold reserves in the bank in lieu of having, physical gold on your person, you have banknotes. And so most of these banks gave out loans to private businesses to develop, farms in the Midwest that are hopefully profitable. And essentially, what injecting silver into the midst of this financial system is that rather than having a bunch of big gold reserves out in the major capital centers like New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, out west there are a whole bunch of silver mines that can actually be accessible where in exchange for one single dollar worth of you know in terms of gold, in terms of banknotes, you could exchange it for X amount of grains of silver. This essentially injects a bunch of currency into the Midwest, financially subsidizing all sorts of schemes to develop land out in the frontiers. This is essentially what the goal of the movement is. Encouraging further bank subsidies of developing unexplored territories out west, as well as subsidizing loans that farmers take out to actually buy farms out on the frontier in the first place. It's kind of
you cut out a
it's kind
bit.
of a
Okay,
process.
cool. Yeah, you cut out a bit there, so I didn't want to interrupt you. It was on my end, not yours. The let me mention as well. So we talked about science earlier. The author does actually give us a little definition of how science was used at the time. So I'll just read that quote. Science, the basic word that every school of thought claimed and worshipped, also altered in meaning to accommodate the revolution. In all varieties of classical theory, science referred to a grand design whose fundamental principles men could comprehend and apply. If the idealists showed a new respect for minute investigation, they eventually subordinated their findings to the laws of a broad social evolution. Bureaucratic thought, on the contrary, made science practically synonymous with scientific method. Science had become a procedure or an orientation rather than a body of results. When it still did not connotate exact truths, it referred to something very specific, the doctor's microbe, not to the laws of a world order. So that's quite interesting because the difference here is what is science? And the bureaucracy, the managerial class, came to view doing the process of doing science as following a particular methodology rather than having an actual body of results that you actually compared your data to. I mean, obviously there's a giant reference we could make here in terms of the pandemic a few years ago, in terms of the importance of following a certain scientific method rather than the actual results it produced. So I think that the comparison is kind of too obvious to spend much time on. There's also another aspect to this sort of this elevation of science and also this bureaucratic methodology that affected people. Quote, the bureaucratic orientation did more than sweep away faculty psychology and its Christian dualism. It obliterated the inner man. The focus had shifted from essences to actions. The new ideas concerned what men were doing and how they did it. As Arthur Bentley said, the individual was meaningless as a unit for investigation. Only men's social behavior deserved analysis. Along with faculty psychology went most of the involvement with heredity and race. Public education reflected the changing psychology rather promptly. From anywhere inside the classical system, education meant mental discipline. Schools should train the good faculties, give them muscle in their fight against the bad. Now, education implied the guidance of behavior in harmony with social processes. If destruction of the faculties eventually cleared the way for modern psychology, its most immediate beneficiary was social engineering. End quote. So I found that a pretty interesting passage. I mean, again, this book was written in 1967, so it's quite far removed, although it's written during the civil rights era, but it's obviously far removed from our circumstances today, at least chronologically. But I guess the point is it's not that far removed from the methodologies today, which were, in fact, as is described by the author here, were developed anywhere from 120 to 140 years ago. Anyone want to comment on what I just read there?
Yeah, the methodology is basically the exact same today and for the exact same purposes. But I don't want to. I've already talked about that, so I don't want to repeat myself. But the thing to keep in mind here that I've always found interesting is that we have different theories of at what point does an empirical observation or test constitute truth or a result or something like that. And if you look at everything that is considered unassailable in empirical science today, it's all arbitrary. It's basically just at what likelihood of this possibly happening do we think that what we have observed is normal out of everything that could be observed. The cutoff is entirely arbitrary, and even entirely mainstream researchers will admit that as well, which leads one to question if everyone, or if a lot of people think that this is arbitrary, and if we've given up on things that we used to establish truth beforehand that weren't purely statistical in nature, what are we doing here? And the only answer is we're trying to forward some sort of policy, societal change, or whatever else. It's extremely bureaucratic. It's one of the means by which power is centralized during this period.
I actually have a number of quotes from this area. So this part of the book is discussing the different professions. I will again read a quote that relates to law. Quote, concepts of the law underwent a comparable, if more complicated, transition. In place of fixed rules in the spirit of Newton, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. offered the alternative of an organic law, evolving in general concert with social custom. The insertion of growth alone, however, did not essentially modify the traditional majesty of the law. A sharper, though largely unformulated break came early in the 20th century with a variety of attempts to gear law to indeterminate process. The most successful was the growing body of administrative law, a direct response to the government's new discretionary powers. In the same vein, the faint introduction of sociological jurisprudence, which would adjust legal decisions to inductive social evidence, the establishment of specialized juvenile and domestic courts, as much involved in counseling and mediating as in pronouncing law, the classification and differential handling of criminals, and the development of probation for adults as well as juveniles, all bent the law towards an adjustment to contingencies. So I think that the key phrase there is, again, early 20th century, the change in jurisprudence toward a sociological angle, which adjusts, quote, adjusts legal decisions to inductive social evidence, end quote. And this is a pretty significant break with prior jurisprudence. And of course, it is obviously there's a incalculable number of cases just the last few years we could reference that are very problematic, shall we say, that involve these sort of special decisions that adjust themselves to social conditions. So how a person is treated by the law depends on their social conditions. This is not new to anyone, but what is interesting is how one of the reasons this book is, I found it interesting and I wanted to cover it, is how these developments that we normally associate with, let's say figures like FDR or post-war or the civil rights era, these are conditions that have been long developing within the United States across all parts of our society ever since the frontier closed. It's not a new thing. It's not even something from the last century. It's from the century before that these processes really started to enter American lives. And that's important to understand when we are trying to understand our own history here. That is really the point here, is not even necessarily to condemn these developments even, but to simply understand where they actually came from. I have a few other things to read, but does anyone want to respond to any of the points I made there, or shall I continue?
Something that I would like to point out throughout all of this is that it's if you do not take the more cynical view that these developments that we're discussing here are meant to fuel political actions, then the only conclusion is that all of this is unnatural and just came out of nowhere. So it's not germane to any of our history. But if you do take the cynical view, which I tend to be in favor of, that all of this was created to sort of justify uh, different political maneuvers and the holding on to power from different groups. Um, Suddenly, it's not unnatural to our history, but it does present a very uh, interesting turn, I guess we could say. Perhaps one of the first times where we can be uh, somewhat self-critical without falling into the traps of, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, where if we find something bad in our history, we have to reject the whole thing that led up to it, because this represents a very clear turning point. I don't think anyone can look at this era and say that it had to happen. This was necessarily going to happen. There were a lot of different movements, different power grabs, and different political machinations that were pretty creative, in all honesty. Which also means that it didn't necessarily have to happen this way, and yet it did. Perhaps all this happening is not good. We can be somewhat self-critical productively here.
I don't know.
Yes.
On the other hand, I do have to say that there is a certain amount of necessity that is built into, I guess, the way that the American political system developed in this particular period. Uh, how do you actually how does a small farming community deal with railroad monopolies, or how does a developing city deal with the fact that there are railroad suburbs on its outskirts, uh, either collectively or individually? These questions are very difficult to answer, and I don't know how a person on the ground should have actually answered these questions in their own time, let alone in retrospect. Um, I think washing your hands and saying that this whole thing was a mistake is, I guess, both callous and naive, given what the circumstances on the ground actually were.
Well, I don't think that's entirely fair, because you had movements at the time pointing out that there were forces coming from outside their community that were causing these events, even the existence of the railroads to begin with. Uh, this and then the other thing as well is that there were also financial forces and people perhaps hinging upon things happening, like farms scaling up to supply places far outside of their own community, such that it's entirely conceivable you could have just let these people get corrected, and then the problem would solve. You don't have to have a whole natural or a national centralization to protect people's investments, for instance. Like, the farming community does not have to be fully connected all the way across the country. Now, there is a big consideration here that I think is perhaps the strongest argument in favor of anything that happened throughout all this, which uh, is it the same country if they can just ignore the other part entirely? There's something to be said through these methods actually creating a national identity, but that's the strongest and most consistent argument that I see. But it doesn't really get into any arguments about efficiency or whatnot else. But that's my own perspective.
In terms of what actually happened, though, right? There were, I guess, the more idealistic and unnatural presupposition, sort of ideological movements, like the Georgists, who sought to use this silver bullet of national land tax to solve the issues of their day, or Canada had a very infamous social credit movement in its own day, or what was it called, like the Triple Alliance or whatever, of like Christian Democrats, Marxists, and whoever else who wanted to use the new national bureaucracies to solve the problems of industrialization. Um, it's it's very difficult to assess what people were dealing with in abstract. I think the Granger laws, in particular, were interesting in terms of trying to deal with and mitigate the excesses of monopoly capital, as well as the rise and fall of the Knights of Labor as they existed.
This leads me into actually populism, which I can tie a few of the things you two just debated together with. And one of the big problems all of these movements had, because there were alternatives to the nationalization that ensued, but one of the problems that they had was that all of these different movements did not unite into a coherent whole that could somewhat ironically centralize itself in a way that could compete at a national level, which is what the Populist Party attempted to do. And it failed very spectacularly, although at the time there was great fear in Washington over this rising force. They did not see its incoming doom. And this poses just an interesting question, which is what you're getting at, which is fair, is what option do you actually have as these people whose lives are being intruded upon by what you perceive as external forces, and you do try to organize, but you're not able to actually effectively coordinate all of your different local community groups, or even statewide groups or regional groups, into a national whole. I'll just leave that on the table for a bit. Let me read a bit from the book to add something concrete here to reference. Quote, the railroads figured much less prominently in Southern populism than they did in the West, where overland transportation was the equivalent of survival. Not only did Western populism take root in the newly developed areas with sparse service and erratic rates, but it thrived particularly where enthusiasm for railroad projects had been running high to the very eve of the Third Party's formation. In Kansas, community assistance had flowed quite heavily into more roads until 1890. And on a smaller scale, localities in Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, and the Dakotas had also been sinking their funds and hopes into fresh enterprises. The arrival of Western populism, in other words, very often marked that breaking point between eager promotion and outraged disappointment, exemplified in Southern Dakota by the 2-year interval between a statute encouraging local aid to railroads and a constitutional prohibition against all forms of public subsidy. While farmers and townsmen had sometimes clashed over details, both had usually agreed upon the necessity of building roads, and both readily joined forces against an alien captor. In general, Western populism demonstrated much more the qualities of cheated development, gathering whole communities into a mutual pact against the enemy, whereas Southern populism, appearing in a more settled and somewhat less expectant region, expressed more that grinding resentment over daily oppressions which often divided communities. One thing contained within what I just read, end quote, one thing I contained within what I just read is this problem that many politicians complained about, which is actually a lot of, at least some of these communities had some forces within them demanding new development, demanding railroads, right? Things like this, so that they could be integrated with these new technologies. But it's a dual-edged sword, because what would happen, as described in the book, is these uh, technologies would be brought to the community, but then they would be so disruptive that basically as soon as they were implemented, the community would then turn against them. So you had this problem where the allegedly, I mean, I'm sure there were dissent on both sides at all times, but there were forces demanding these things be brought in, and then as soon as they were brought in, there were as powerful, if not more powerful, countervailing forces demanding that things be controlled or taken out. And ultimately, this is how populism as a third political party at the national level came into being, was the coherence of opposition to railroads and other forces that had been brought into these societies. But as was described there, with differences between Western and Southern populism, the broad connections of opposition to these changes being brought in, be them through reconstruction or the development of railroads or what have you, they were actually rooted in fundamentally different things. So the problem is, how do you actually coordinate all of these different complaints into a coherent national force that can actually achieve its goals for everyone in some sense? This is a major problem they have. I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn in the failure of populism ultimately. And it's an understandable failure, but one we can't really afford to repeat. And I feel a lot of kinship with the populist movement, and in terms of what we're doing. Obviously, it's a political party versus, the Old Glory Club, for example, is ultimately a fraternal and social club. But nevertheless, we and many other peoples have an interest in the future of our country, right? But people come from all these different perspectives. How do you actually solve that problem? Perhaps that is a problem that, I mean, I would say we have done a fairly good job of solving those problems within our group, and keeping the group oriented with its all its different constituent interests coordinated in a way that actually provides some sort of coherence. Anyway, those were just some postulations I had. Do you two have anything to add on everything I just said there?
I'd like to hear Clossington's thoughts if he has any. Perhaps not. I was just going to say this is a. I think this is a. Regardless of whether you are a part of a political organization or not, like you said, we're fraternal. I think this is ultimately indicative that we need a coherent and non-contradictory political formula that is. And this is a part of where I break with a lot of people in the online sphere. They very much dislike abstract, non-particular things, which is fine and all. But if you try to make a coherent national level political formula around so many particularities, it's just going to be internally contradictory. It's very much the failure of the populists is the inability to nail down what their political formula actually is, other than corruption is bad. In which case, that's great, but it immediately got co-opted by the other parties as well. Corruption is bad, we can handle that. The populists wanted something more, but they weren't able to reconcile what exactly they wanted.
No, and in fact, as the author writes, the populists at the National Convention ultimately ended up nominating a Democrat, I believe it was William Jennings Bryan, if I recall, as their candidate, which basically sealed the fate of the destruction of the Populist Party, in that they it would be, in modern terms, it would be like the Libertarian Party nominating I don't know. Just pick a random Democrat or Republican, right? It would destroy your movement if you nominated someone from one of the literal opposition parties that you're supposedly operating against. And of course, in this case, it was even worse because the populists actually had a significant chance to win the election if the proper organizational structure and decisions had taken place there. So I found the story of the populists compelling and highly related, actually, to our modern circumstances. And that was one of the reasons, out of several, I wanted to read this book because, unlike, well, the previous books we have read have been about periods lost to history. It's a bit about previous American peoples that we are descended from, but no longer are in a direct sense. But in this period, I think there's still a very direct connection to it. We're very much still dealing with the fallout of this part of American history, the part of American history that occurred, as the book is titled, 1877 to 1920. And it's important to understand this as a reference point because, again, so much of our focus is on our much more recent history, like the 1960s and the civil rights era, and it's ignoring the fundamental issues that came about in this time in our history. And as Clossington has taken pains to point out, there are legitimate reasons that these developments took place. It's interesting because the middle class in modern America tends to be, it's almost like pseudo worshipped entity, like it's the most important thing, right? The middle class. And that's not to counter signal that, but to say that according to the book's thesis, the middle class that we ourselves are descended from also produced the managerial revolution through active participation that we complain about. And you really have to understand the complexity of the problems that people were dealing with, but also the very long history that this bureaucracy has and why it existed in the first place if you actually want to propose any alternatives, right? Because this was tried and it failed. The alternative, when national power was first developing, failed. So to present any alternative to managerial bureaucracy, you really have to understand why it was the force that ultimately went out in the first place.
I will say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
Something we haven't really discussed. I think I briefly mentioned it before we went live. One of the, and I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about the merits of this more bureaucratic or progressive form of organization, is actually constructing a coherent national identity or coherent nation. Something we haven't really discussed yet that kind of goes hand in hand with a lot of these populists out west was that a lot of the European immigrants that had arrived a few decades earlier, their children were much less docile. So since in these streams we really like to talk about the people and the different ethnicities, the actual groups of people that compose the country, at least according to the author, and I haven't actually read into this part very much myself. The first generation of a lot of the German and Irish immigrants from the decades prior were much more docile and assimilationist, whereas their children were not at all. So part of these the more establishment or even bureaucratic laws that we've been talking about that these populists tended to not get along with, at least until the very twilight of their movement. These also had the upside of sort of trying to clamp down on ethnic conflicts from waves of immigrants that people had expected them to sort of assimilate into the country, but their children proved that to be incorrect. I feel like we should mention that since we're nearing the 1.5 hour points, we have to be getting closed soon.
There's a particularly striking piece of propaganda produced in this time. It's a little political cartoon of a Knights of Labor individual. In one hand, he's strangling the capitalist, but on the other hand, he's strangling the anarchist. Um, it should be noted that among the sort of American stock or like Anglo stock that actually was able to settle out in the Midwest, they had a particular animosity towards the sort of 48ers, the German immigrants who settled out there. I believe it was during I think it was like the 15th anniversary of the Grand Army of the Republic that William Tecumseh Sherman um, announced to all the war veterans that in this one speech he recommended that they develop in the Midwest like Ku Klux Klans to start lynching quote unquote black flag anarchists among the more recent immigrants to the Midwest. It's it's particularly striking. I think certain individuals like the sort of Sandbach types will note that there were Hegelian societies and sort of continental German philosophy minded individuals um, that populated throughout the Midwest, particularly Minnesota, where you had a lot of activity among the first like Socialist Party in the early like 1910s. But the actual heritage Americans didn't particularly have many good things to say about these individuals. Class conflict is sort of a continentalism. Meanwhile, in the American scene, we're much more in favor of a sort of class collaborationism that did not devolve into such grotesque forms as socialist parties or communist parties later on, is what I'd like to say.
Well, yeah, and that's a pretty common line of thought that people can find around our circles, at least. The thing that I found most interesting with pretty severe implications, though, is that beyond the 48ers being a minority of Germans, if you take the totality of Irish and Germans that had settled, the author points out the first generation was mostly unremarkable, and if I remember correctly, I believe it was that first generation that received a good chunk of the backlash on account of their immigration status. The thing that I find most interesting is that it was the second generation of these people that tended to cause the most trouble. So when they're talking about fighting black flag anarchists and whatnot else, there are several recent immigrants that would be referring to, especially of the southern and eastern European varieties. But that does leave out the second generation Irish and German that apparently, at least according to the author, causes quite a lot of issue for the old American establishment. That was
Well,
something that I thought was new that I hadn't really heard from many of our circles.
in particular, I believe there was it something like 800 very particularly nasty 48ers who were sort of liberal proto-socialists that were kicked out of northern Germany during the revolutions of 48 that ended up migrating towards the Midwest that formed these societies that were particularly nasty and un-American. I should note that what was there? There was an immigration law towards the late 1890s, early 1900s that particularly forbade the immigration of anarchists to America. This is events like the Haymarket Affair really punctuate why this happened as a sort of like nonpartisan, we don't want any of these people here kind of impulse.
Yeah, I want to tie this, now that we're talking about identity a little bit, I want to at least make a few ties to American identity, since that is mostly what we focus on, and this has been a little different than what we've been doing. But I'll read a quote that relates to this. So, quote: "These men and women," and he's talking about the managerial or the middle class, "communicated so well in part because they were the ones building a new structure of loyalties to replace the decaying system of 19th century communities. As members of the new middle class found the rewards more and more in the uniqueness of an occupation and in its importance to a rising scientific industrial society, the primary differentiators of the 19th century weakened proportionately. They lost the appreciation for fine graduations in wealth and its display, that close emotional involvement in differences between English and Irish and Swedish and Bohemian. The compulsive identification with a political party also waned. Although they usually retained the party label of their fathers and some traces of the old feeling, they tended to subordinate that loyalty to new ones drawn from their occupation, its values, and its policies. Joining an occupational organization was a defining as well as an identifying act. Just as a political party had once done, now the occupational association supplied many answers, hopes, and enemies far beyond the range of their immediate experience. Where a shift in party allegiance had once been treason, it became not only possible, but in some circulars popular, opening the way to various forms of nonpartisan and interest group politics." End quote. So I think that contrasts well with the ethnic problems and developments that you two were just describing there, because at the same time, there is a new man developing who, rather than identify with his ethnic interests necessarily, there's an identification with his profession. And I thought that was interesting because at the beginning of the stream, Clossington pointed out, I am an engineer, I belong to this association, and all of us really do very much identify in the middle class with our profession. It is actually part of our identity, not and our identity as Americans is tightly coupled with our profession and its place in our society. I thought that was an interesting observation, just because I could see one of us, and of course I do this as well. I think most middle class people do this. They very much identify with their profession, and it's certainly not invalid, right? But at the same time, the extent to which it overrides who you are ethnically, we can see how it, especially when other ethnic groups may still more tightly pursue their own ethnic interests, we can see how that can be a problem. So, to the extent that the American ethnicity is replaced with a professional one, it certainly damages the American people, but at the same time, there has to be a way to reconcile that professional identity as well, because, like it or not, I mean, the reality is that it is part of our identities, and it, as we see here, over 100 years ago, these middle class people had the exact same view of themselves, at least according to the author. So I just found that interesting. What do any of you two have thoughts on this concept of profession and identity, and sort of tying it into some of the themes we've discussed on prior shows? Yeah. Okay. Well.
Yeah, I don't really have much more to add.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily expect so either. I think probably a good idea to start wrapping this one up. There's a lot of other. I mean, the book is quite dense, to be honest. There's many other things that one could get into, such as Roosevelt in particular. But I don't want to sort of belabor this stream, because I think the point has more or less been made about what happened after the frontier closed. What were the sort of main developments happening in America in terms of where people went when that period of American history closed? They went into this middle class, they went into professional bureaucracies, they involved themselves in managerial processes that brought national power to the communities, and this can simultaneously be celebrated, but we can also recognize that it also destroyed those communities. It destroyed the frontier, and that's definitely something we have to reckon with in terms of where we're going as a people. So that's pretty much, I think, all I have to say on the book as a whole. Anyone else have any?
There is kind of a good point of the development of American foreign policy towards the end. Was it like
Yeah, I remember you
chapters
mentioned
10
that.
or 11? I have a particular interest because I've been putting together like a little model ship of like the USS Olympia, the flagship of the U.S. fleet that stormed, Manila Bay during the Spanish-American War. So about for about the next 20 years after the Civil War, we kind of let our Navy kind of rot in harbor, with like outdated monitors and outdated steam sloops. But after experiencing a few particularly nasty uh, international incidents, like a few of our pirates tried to smuggle arms into Cuba here, or like, we tried to, subsidize shenanigans elsewhere in the Spanish Empire there. We realized that, hey, the Brazilian Navy was bigger than our Navy in the mid 17 or 6 or 1870s. So we actually started to develop something of a military industrial complex, at least navally in Philadelphia, which ended up creating this sort of behemoth that peaked during World War II. But it all sort of develops at the beginning of this time that we start to discuss with sort of pronouncements of Alfred Mahan and his ilk, sort of early progressive public intellectuals. It's it's a particularly neglected time in American history, but it's one that I find particularly interesting in how sort of niche and steampunk it ends up being.
Yeah, and actually, now would be a good time to shill your channel. You did what was the topic of the stream you did this weekend with Endeavor,
So
actually, our Canadian friend?
so so on Saturday I did a retrospective review of the Hornblower miniseries. It's think Master and Commander, except 8 whole episodes, each being like an hour and a half long. I had an excellent time revisiting that particular series, and I have a live stream series where I just put together like model ships on my own spare time while having various guests on live streams. That's what I've been up to on my personal channel.
Yeah, you've been streaming a lot actually, and I've caught some of those. They're pretty good. So definitely recommend people go check out your channel because you're a lot more active on it lately, and yeah, you're producing some good content. Um, Ryan, anything you want to say, or did you want to say anything else on foreign policy, Clossington? Just since that is the book does close with foreign policy, it is kind of a separate topic, but there are a few chapters actually dedicated to the fact that this came into being after this time because now that national power exists, there was a small cadre of people who were interested in exploring how that power could be used abroad for opportunities.
If I want to sort of put a nice cap on that particular subject, the issue of God, guns, and was it God, guns, and gold being the particular accentuation of that particular era of diplomacy. Uh, American politicians didn't want to actually invade other foreign countries unless there were gross I guess, breaches in civilized diplomacy. So if another country didn't actually, if other countries didn't, uh, pay their national debts to our creditors, or if they decide to, um, I don't know, decide to nationalize particular industries, that is what we didn't stand for. Otherwise, we took a very neglectful, hands-off, reactive approach to how we handled foreign diplomacy. Uh, but both parties didn't actually like to. They didn't like to do any sort of imperialism. It was much more reactive and letting our merchants do whatever they wanted to do on the ground, and then post hoc justifying any sort of diplomatic incidents um, if any of the foreign countries decide to do anything shady. But that's how I describe the foreign diplomacy at this time.
Yeah, very good summary, actually. Ryan, anything you'd want to say in closing before I announce the next book we're going to be reviewing?
Just to summarize, one of the perspectives you can take away from this, and hopefully some point in the future we can actually have one of our discussion streams that we have on a potential list, not based around a book but on discussion. But I feel like in this period you see a pretty large bargain in which we trade away sort of the soul of the country, the community, people being tied to the land, the older idea of the middle class, and it gives way to a much more centralized, nationalized, bureaucratic class that didn't necessarily need to exist. And with that, you start seeing America as a not as a what we've discussed so far was that America is a specific group of people. Its interests are over here uh, in the new world. However, whenever you start seeing this more nationalized power projection, and the potential for war, even if the justifications are only reactionary, our scope starts to expand far beyond the people here. And I think that it's pretty clear to see how even the reactive justifications for war can slowly turn into the country getting hijacked to occupy part of Europe, rebuild it, and whatnot else in later wars, become a sort of world policeman and whatnot else. I feel like as I was reading this book, my reaction to the developments was much more negative than perhaps other books that we've read about different time periods, just because it feels like this is not the point where things go wrong, nor is anything necessarily going to go wrong. I don't think we have to do this weird intellectual exercise where we trace back everything going wrong to the dawn of time. But I feel like you can make a pretty good case that this is a major turning point that leads us down a perhaps worse direction than we were going beforehand. So that was my perspective as I was reading the book. I think that came out in a lot of my points that I brought up, but that's all I really have to say.
Definitely. I had a fairly negative view as well. I tried to not express that too much in the stream and be a little more balanced, but yeah, overall that I agree 100% with your take. There's a lot of stuff we didn't cover. The book is quite dense. This is the second time I've read it. I cannot say it's a particularly enjoyable read. It's for the reasons we covered earlier. That said, it is a solid overview of many aspects of this large period in American history. And it can certainly provide you with a lot of subtopics to look into, whether it's specific labor movements or specific politicians, or pseudo religious characters like Bellamy, who is mentioned a few times in this book with his utopian novel, I suppose, Looking Backward. There's a lot of other things in the book that we didn't even discuss in this sort of high level overview. But if you want to really look into this period and how it relates to sort of our modern problems as a potential starting point, this book is quite serviceable. All right,
I really had like a nasty, like I really did not like this book because of how
that's totally fine. Yeah.
like I kind of hated actually slogging through this thing. In spite of the fact that it's called like In Search for Order, or like The Search for Order, it's very like disorderly. Um, it doesn't have a particular narrative that's following through. Um, it's just
I would have
some,
preferred if it maintained a more chronological uh, progression. I don't know about you, but
yeah, I really didn't like how scatterbrained a lot of the narrative ended up feeling like. It wasn't very. It's difficult to digest, I guess. Um, like, okay, so who is saying what, or who is trying to do what at a one time? It's like it's very difficult to actually pinpoint like what the through line narrative is. Like, if his subject was this is what the progressives were, like, okay, but no, he does like this thing where he's like, okay, so they said this and then they said that, and I don't know, it's
so actually this relates
sure.
to and we'll wrap up in a second because now we're just sort of talking business, but this sort of relates to next week's book because I had picked up a book in the bookstore on the Articles of Confederation and that period of history by an author named Merrill Jensen, and I was looking at reviews of it, like should we review this book? And then I found out that he has a prior book titled "The Articles of Confederation: An Interpretation of the Social Constitutional History of the American Revolution, 1774 to 1781." And this book is actually I looked into it. It's an essential part of the accepted narrative of the Articles of Confederation up until a certain point in our history. And this book, unlike his second book on the Articles of Confederation, is sort of arguing a point. And after reading this book, I found myself kind of wishing for a book more like that. Whereas this one is a fairly good history book, even though it's a bit scatterbrained. It's not really arguing a specific point in a coherent way. And I've found that I do prefer books like that. So next week, I have selected a book on the Articles of Confederation that is probably in the top. It may well be described as the top book on the Articles of the Confederation. It was written in 1940, so this is a pre-war book as well. Should be of interest to the readers, and hopefully it will actually fill that niche where it argues a point rather than simply describes, which is kind of the main issue I had with this one. So I agree with you, although I do think the book is a good starting point because it does provide a decent broad overview of the period and some of the intellectual trends going on. Let me get to the super chats now. We've got one from Donnie B, that's Dawn Browning, for $20. Sent a super sticker with an anthropomorphic dancing pear that says "You are amazing" written around it. So thank you very much for your traditional super sticker contribution, Mrs. Browning. And Solid Snake 1964 once again says, "Doing great work with the series. Keep it up. Thank you very much, Mr. Sneck." Melon for $15. Cheers. Reminder that you can download the MP3 of these from the OGC Substack and send them to history buff normie friends. Yes, thank you for the reminder, Melon. In fact, we have an RSS feed, and there are numerous ways if you check our Twitter to download the podcast now. Whether you want to listen on YouTube, Spotify, or your podcast catcher app or whatnot, you can do that. Or just download them from the Substack, as Melon said. And finally, we've got Christopher Burks, $2. He sends us a salute. Thank you for the donations, everyone. So, yeah, next week we will be back covering another neglected period of our history, which is the history of the Articles of Confederation, as argued from the point of Merrill Jensen.